Let's get started with this webinar. Welcome everyone. I have muted everyone by default. What we'll do is I'll give some time to ask questions. So we'll do a Q&A after I've given this talk. It's about 30 minutes or something. So then we'll have enough time for Q&A if anyone has any questions. So what we're going to talk about today is web scraping and APIs in 45 minutes. This was a talk that I gave at Inspire Europe. That was about 2.5 weeks ago now, I think. And yeah, it's the title says it's web scraping and APIs in 45 minutes. So we're going to talk about these two topics in the next 45 minutes. Back then, when I did this at Inspire, it was a hands-on training session. So this is not going to be a hands-on training session because I haven't shared any of the files with you. Nor is it useful to have a webinar trying to share screens because I don't think everyone has a dual screen to follow along. If you're interested in more training about web scraping and APIs, then I will share links to our meetup page during and after this talk, in which you can sign up for more hands-on training. What I will do in this session is mainly showcase what I trained on in this session at Inspire. Yeah, so let's get started. And what we wanted to do at Inspire was at the Alteryx conference was use web scraping and APIs to answer the following problem statement. At the time of Inspire, the Alteryx team were very keen to take us out for dinner, but we were wondering where should we go and how can we figure out where we can go? Well, we can actually use Alteryx for that, and we can use web scraping and APIs to answer that question. So what I'm going to talk about is how we can use web scraping to get some postcode information from TripAdvisor. And once we got postcode information from TripAdvisor, we're going to use that to send a request to an API. And we're going to talk about what APIs and web scraping is, of course. And when we send that request, we are getting the geolocation back of these restaurants. Okay? So this is going to be a workflow that's going to contain, the first part is going to be about web scraping, and the second part of the workflow is going to be about APIs. Okay? And this is really cool about Alteryx, is that you can have one workflow in which you do multiple processes. Also, what this workflow will do is it has some spatial tools in it. So within one workflow, you can do web scraping, APIs, and do some geocoding. So that's really cool. So before I'm going to start, a little introduction about myself. I'm Andre. I am originally from the Netherlands. I've been working at the Information Lab for about 4 years now. The Alteryx Inspire conference a few weeks ago was my 4th Alteryx conference. It was mainly, I've only been to the ones in Europe, so hopefully next year I can go to the ones in the US, because I'd like to see how those conferences are. But yeah, so whenever I use Alteryx, as it says, I can apply all of my like coding wizardry in the tool. But when I use Alteryx, I have all of that power as well at my fingertips. So that's a really cool quote there. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, a little bit of a discussion about what web scraping is and what the differences are with APIs. And after that, I'm going to show you how to do web scraping, how to show you to do APIs. And what we did at the Inspire conference is we had a little pub quiz. We're not going to do a pub quiz today because I don't think this is the best setup to do a pub quiz because I can't award any prizes today. So let's start talking about what is web scraping. And in this talk, I focused on 3 things: the what of web scraping, the why, and some of the complexities of doing web scraping. Now, what is web scraping? First of all, it's, as the slide says, it's the process of extracting data from a web page in an automated fashion. And this automated fashion is really important because if you just go to a website where you select some text or you see a table on, for example, Wikipedia, and you copy paste that and paste it somewhere, that is not web scraping. That is just copy pasting data. The whole point of web scraping is that you create something that is automated. Okay? And this is why Alteryx is so good, because with Alteryx, we can automatically set up a workflow that scrapes the data. Okay, so that's mainly the what. It's like focusing on an automated way of getting data from a website. Now you're probably wondering, why should we do web scraping? Well, quite often data that we want to get is not in a database, or we don't have easily access to it. The data sits somewhere on a website or in a custom built portal. What we can do with web scraping then is we can use some of the techniques that I will show you later to grab that information from that website. Okay? With that extra information, you can, for example, enrich your analysis and as the slide says, take your business analysis to the next level. Okay? So web scraping is going to be a really useful skill if you know how to do that in Alteryx. But there are some kind of small complexities to web scraping. First of all, web scraping, you need to know a little bit about how the web is built. The web is built with three languages, basically, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And for web scraping, we tend to need to know a little bit about HTML. The other two, you don't really need to know that much, especially if you use Alteryx. So for HTML, you need to know how a website is structured, and every website is structured differently. So the process of getting data from a website is different each time. Okay? So later when we look at APIs, you will see that APIs have a little bit more structure to them, whilst web scraping is fairly unstructured. The other problem with web scraping is that legally, it's actually kind of a minefield, because sometimes I'm also being asked by customers as well to do some web scraping, but very often the terms and conditions of a website say that you're not allowed to get data from this particular site. So you need to know and read the terms and conditions of a website before you're actually trying to get data. You might be blocked, like an IP ban or something, if you make too many requests to a website. And we don't want that, of course. So yeah, legally web scraping is a bit of a minefield. The other problem with web scraping is that not all the content that you see on a website is what we call loaded on the server. And this goes a little bit into understanding how websites are being generated. So a website can be generated in two places, on the server and on the client. And client is basically your laptop, your desktop computer, on which you have a browser. So if it's being generated in the client, that basically means that it's loaded through JavaScript, and that makes it really difficult to get the data. So very good examples of websites that are very hard to web scrape are like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, your pages that are really dynamically generated. Okay? So if pages are dynamically generated, then it's very hard to get data from it. Okay, but I'll show you as well how to identify which websites are easy versus which ones are a bit more difficult. Now, websites are easily scrapable if they are server-side generated, because what that means is that when you make a request to a website by just typing in the URL is being sent to basically your request is sent to the server, and you're getting back a response. And that response is already the HTML that has been generated on the server. So that means you can get it. Now, we're only talking about this in a way in Alteryx, of course. So in Alteryx, it's a bit difficult to get client-side generated data from a website. So that is web scraping. It's all about getting data from a website in an automated fashion. Now, the other part of this talk that I hosted at Inspire was about APIs. And APIs, we also have the what, why, and complexities. And APIs are a bit of a mystery to some people. So APIs are, as the slide says, a structured methodology that allow you to get data from or post data to a web application. Okay? So APIs are all about communication. The word API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it allows you to communicate between a server and a client. Okay? They are, as the slide says, a structured methodology. And what you can do with these APIs is you can, for example, get some data from an API or send data to an API, update data to an API, or delete data. So a good example is if you buy a plane ticket. So soon I'll go to the US again. And when I buy a ticket, what I'll do is I make a, first of all, a GET request. I'm trying to get some information about different planes and different flights. And once I made that GET request, actually I want to create and make a booking. So I send the POST request with my information, passport details. But what if I make a mistake in that booking? Well, then I can send a PUT request, and a PUT request is for updating your ticket. Now, if I'm not happy with the ticket that I booked, I can send a delete request and I can delete it. All of that is normally taking place in the user interface of, like, in Skyscanner, for example, like a website, or British Airways where you book a flight. But in the background, you're making API calls. Okay, so everyone on this call has already used APIs, even without knowing them. Now, why should you use APIs? Now, the main type of API that we're talking about is a REST API. And REST stands for Representational State Transfer. What that means is that you basically have several what we call endpoints. Those are just URLs in which you can get or send data. You also sometimes, if you read documentation about APIs, you encounter two other types of APIs. The SOAP API, which traditionally sends you data back in XML form. And a fairly new one that we have nowadays is GraphQL, and GraphQL sends data back in JSON. And REST APIs also normally send you data back in JSON, CSV, or XML. Okay, so those are the responses that you get. And it's a lot easier to integrate these APIs because the data comes back in a structured fashion. So that's why we want to use APIs, because they can really also enrich your analysis. However, there are some complexities with APIs. Authentication, because APIs are normally not open. And what I mean with open is that you can just get all the data from it. Often the creators of APIs, they want to monitor who's making requests and also how many requests you're making. And you can basically set some authentication on API, and there are different methods of authentication. We are going to use an authentication method as well. 1 second. Chat. Cool. Yes, I am recording this. Yes, I'm not sure if we're going to send it out today, but we will record it. And I will share the files as well with you after this session. So let me move this one again. Now, well, yeah, authentication. So the API that we're going to use is the travel time API, which allows you to geocode postcodes. And that one also has authentication. It has an API key and an API ID. So that means that the people that build this travel time API can monitor how many requests I'm making, because you want to avoid people overloading your API. Because in fact, an API is just a way to communicate with a database. If someone harvest your database, they could potentially well, make it offline. So that's a bit of a problem. Another one is the rate limiting, because if you have those authentication methods, quite often there's some rate limits to these. And rate limits are, for example, that you can only send 100 requests a minute, for example, or 50 requests an hour or something. So yeah, that limits how much data you can get and at what speed you can get this data. Cool. So let's take a look at an Alteryx workflow. If I hop into Alteryx, the workflow that I'm going to build for you is going to geocode restaurant locations. And this is a completed workflow. So what we see here is this is a template built off by my colleague Ben Moss. Again, you can get this template as well once we send out the files. And what we have here on the left-hand side is we start with 10 inputs of restaurants. So if I expand this, we can see we have some links to TripAdvisor from different restaurants. Then we have a tool, and this tool is called the download tool. And the download tool is the most useful tool when you do web scraping and when you do APIs. Because with this download tool, you're actually making requests to a website for web scraping, and you're making a request to an API when you do APIs. Now, what we have in here is we have a URL and the output method, okay? And then we're getting some data back. Now, we will parse that response. Once we've parsed it, we will send that API request. And the API that we're using is the travel time API. It sends data back in JSON format. So that means that the data is then being sent back. We transform it and we output it. So that means that we had 10 restaurants, 10 URLs. And from those URLs, we're getting the postcode. And then you can see on the map here, the locations of those individual restaurants. The Alteryx conference was hosted at Tobacco Docks, and we choose like 10 restaurants that are somewhere near that location. Okay, so this is the completed workflow. You will also get those. Now, if I go to the starting workflow, we are starting off with those URLs, but we're filtering down to one URL. And I would highly recommend doing that as well whenever you start web scraping or making API requests, because it makes it a little bit easier to look at the data, but also you're not sending quite a lot of requests and it will go a lot faster. Okay. So what we're going to look at first is the website from which I want to get some data. So I'm just going to hop into a browser, and I would recommend using a browser such as Google Chrome or Firefox to use when you do web scraping. Now, as you can see here, this is the Golden Chippy, which is a fish and chips restaurant in London. And what we want to get out of this website is the actual postcode of this restaurant, because then we can plot all of the individual restaurants on a map. Now, this is just a user interface, and what we don't want to do is manually having to copy paste this postcode here on the top, because that is not web scraping. In order to do web scraping, you can use the inspector of a website. So you can inspect how this website has been built. And because TripAdvisor uses the same structure of the website for all of the restaurants, we can scrape one website or set up the scraper for one website, and then we can run it for all 10 of them. So what I can do is I can right click in my browser and I can say inspect. And what inspect will do is it will show you on the right-hand side, or whatever you have specified for this one, the breakdown of how the HTML of the website is structured. Now, this is a fairly complex website, and the HTML normally consists of like the head, which is some meta information about a website, and the body. And the body contains all of the text and stuff that you see on the page. Now, what we want to get is the postcode. Now we can use this. If I hover over, you can see the individual elements of a website. So if I hover over, you can see here, I'm going to this, for example, this is a div, which is a container. But we can also check if this website has been generated client-side or server-side. And we can do that as follows by just right-clicking the website and then say, view page source. The view page source will open up a quite a large new tab here with lots of information. And if there is the data that you're looking for, what you can see, so here we can see this actual postcode. If that is in here, that means it's server-side generated. Otherwise, it's client-side generated. Now, this is lots of text, and yeah, you need to kind of familiarize yourself a little bit with HTML in order to be able to read all of this. I wouldn't recommend reading all of it, but what we can do is we can actually search through this by using Control F on our keyboard. And I can type in postal code, and then what I see is it highlights it in orange here. You can see postal code and then the actual postal code after it. So this is the part of the website that I want to get. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going into Alteryx now and see how we can set that up there. So the first thing to do in order to get data from a website is to use the download tool. And the download tool can be found in the developer section. And I can drag in the download tool. After that, I need to specify which field contains a URL. Well, we called our field URL, so there we go. Then we can set headers, payload, and connection. We don't really need to do anything here. The only thing that you need to make sure is that you're outputting this data to a string. You can also output it immediately to a file, but that will just download the HTML for you. What I then tend to do is I put a browse tool after this to inspect the data and hit run. Now this will, whenever you get data back from the download tool, you're getting two columns. One called download data, containing the actual data that you've downloaded, and download headers. And download headers contains the headers that have been returned to from the website. So if I double click this one, what we can see is that we're getting a 200 response and it says okay. So that means it's been a successful response. If you don't get 200, but say 404, that means that the response wasn't successful. Okay, so whenever you see 200, that means that it's correct and you're getting back the correct HTML of the website. Now, everything is in one little cell here, which is incredibly difficult to work with. So the tool that we need to use to parse this HTML is the regex tool. And we have another webinar specifically focused on this regex tool coming up. You can learn more about that on the websites that I will show you later. So what I will do is I go to the parse section and I grab the regex tool. Now the regex tool is your friend if you want to do web scraping. So if you want to do web scraping, you need to know a little bit about regex, regular expressions. Now the column that we want to grab the data from is our download data. There we go. And then we can skip that for a bit, but we can go to the output methods. Now for regex, we have 4 types of outputs. We have the replace, which will basically, depending on the regular expression that you're typing in, will replace whatever has been found. You can tokenize, which is similar to text to columns. It will split to rows or columns. You can do a match, which will return a Boolean, which is true or false. Or you can use parse, and that will actually parse out the value that you're looking for. So that's the one we are looking for. There we go. And now we need to put in the regular expression. Now the regular expression that I want to put in, I've also put in my little cheat sheet here, which is like the info here. And I can actually grab that because there's no real point in me having to type all of that out. There we go. And I'm going to call this my postcode. So here at the bottom, we can rename the field that we generate. So that's postcode. And what we're doing is postal code that was on the website that we saw. And then here we're writing some regular expression to grab all of the data up until we see the double quote. So if I hop back into the website, which is here, we can see we have postal codes, and then it closes itself off again with a quote. So it only grabs us SE10 8LF in this case, but depending on which restaurant you're scraping this for, of course. So there we go. So if I unclick that, and now what is pretty cool about Alteryx since a few versions ago is that we can cache all of this. So that means if I right click this tool, I can say cache and run workflow. What that will do is we'll run it once, but then it will cache it. So it keeps it in memory. This also means that you don't have to make this same web request over and over again. So now, for example, my workflow run in 2.1 seconds. The cached version runs in 0.9. So that's a whole second that we win there. So that's great. Now we have the response here, which is our postcode. So that's great. We're getting the correct postcode back. But now we want to find the latitude and longitude of this particular postcode. Now, for that, what we can do is we can use an API to get that. And the API that we're getting and that we're using is the travel time API. We've partnered with this company for specifically, basically for this session. And my colleague Ben is also building some stuff for this company. Now, what you can do with this API, if we go to the resources and go to API documentation, is here we have the travel time search API. And this is really good API documentation because it tells you exactly what you can do with it. So on the left-hand side, we have some of the endpoints that we can get data from. So for example, we want to use this geocoding one. So the geocoding one allows us to search for particular latitude and longitude, some geographic information for, this can be, as you can see here, a postcode or even a street name in a particular location. And as you can see here, we're gonna make GET requests here. Okay. So now what we can do is if what we need an application ID and an application key. Okay, these are just examples, you can't copy them. But you can get one by clicking on this Get API key here, and I will include links to this as well in some of the docs. Yeah, so how can we make API requests? Well, we're using URLs as well for this. So what we first need to do is we need to construct a URL to download this data. So what I'd like to do is actually first let's get rid of the data that I don't need. So I don't need some of the data that is listed there. So let me get rid of some of those, and we can use a select tool for that. So I'm just going to have to put in a select tool. And what I want to keep is the URL and the postcode. So I don't need the headers anymore. And that will just give me just those two columns. And what I now like to do is make that API request. But I first need to build the API URL. And I can do that by using the formula tool. So if I bring the formula tool in, I'm just going to bring that here in the canvas. I can give this a name. So let me see, I'm just going to call this one let me just call this my API URL. Doesn't really matter how you're calling this. And now you need to find the API endpoint. Now, if it's a good API, you just read the documentation. And I read the documentation. I just kept the API key, or sorry, not the API key, the API URL in my cheat sheet. And if I go then to the formula tool and paste that in, there we go. And what this is doing is here we have the URL, so api.traveltime.com, version 4, and then the part of the API that I'm using is a geocoding endpoint. And then for search, I'm adding a query that is the postcode that I got from the website. So here you can see this fish and chips place is now the actual postcode is the query. So for this particular one, I'm getting some data back. Okay. We can change the size of this. We don't really need to make that big. So let's make that 500. And now we can actually make that request. So I can go to the developer section, bring in my download tool, and I need to specify a field for which I want to do this, which is my API URL. And yeah, I could get send this request. However, as the documentation stated, I need to actually send some data with it. So I can send this postcode, but I also need to add something to the headers. And that is a way to identify who I am. Now, I got some API keys from this company. So I need to copy in these values. So just bear with me for a second. So I'm gonna copy that one in. This is the value. There's no need to try and write these down because we will disable these API keys after this session. But you can request an API key with these people if you want. There we go. And the last bit is my actual key. This just really depends on what API you're using and what kind of authentication. This is just authentication to the application ID and API key. So we're sending that with the request. Now, if I now hit run and I go to my browse, we can see that I'm now getting, again, a 200 response, indicating that this was a valid request. Cool. So now what we want to do is we want to parse this out, and the data that I'm getting back is in JSON format. I can also see that the content type here is application JSON. So I need to know how to parse this. Now, luckily, Alteryx has a really handy tool, which is the JSON parse tool, which can also be found in the developer section. I'm going to drag my JSON parse in here. And with the JSON parse, I need to specify which field we want to parse, which is download data, because that's the actual field that contains JSON. And what I'm going to do again is I'm going to cache this because I don't want to keep on hitting the API because this one has a limit of 100 requests a minute. So if I say cache and run workflow, we'll make that API request, but then also keep the request response in memory. Now, we're getting the data back, which is excellent. It has been parsed, and we can see we have features.0.type, features.0geometry.type. So we need to actually parse this out a little bit more. And we want to turn this into a structured columns and row structure that we can use in, for example, a tool like Tableau. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to parse this with the text to column tool. Everyone that's used Excel is familiar with that one, I think. The field that I want to split is the name. The actual delimiter is, as I can see, a period. And I want to parse 4 columns. This is literally, I know it's 4 because I've done this before, but this is also something that you need to trial and error. And what you normally do is you count the number of dots here, the number of periods, and then you add another one, so +1. That's kind of the way to do that. So if I hit run, we'll now generate 4 individual columns here. As you can see, we have features, we have the JSON name. Let me see if I can move this thing. There we go. JSON name 3, and the actual, these are the column headers. So JSON name 4 is my column headers. I can turn these around by going to transform, and then I can go from rows into columns by using the crosstab tool. So the crosstab tool, I want to crosstab, let's actually do this on the URL, postcode, API URL. It doesn't really matter, they're all the same anyway. And the column headers are going to be my JSON name 4, because in that we have the type and coordinate 0 and coordinates 1. Those are my longitude and latitude. And then I need to specify what the values are. And the values in this case are my JSON value string, which is this particular area. So we can see we have longitude, latitude, some more information of where this restaurant is located. And we can set a method for aggregation. We can just use concat, which is fine. Let's hit run. And there we go. We now turn this from JSON format into something a little bit nicer to look at. And let's actually make these coordinates longitude and latitude by renaming that field, bringing in a select tool. And coordinate 0 here, I think it's longitude. So a little tip, in Alteryx you can also type in lon and lat. And then spatial tools will later on recognize those as longitude and latitude. I think I have that correct. Let's see how that goes later on. Actually, let me show you. So normally you can grab that if you go to the API documentation, and we can see the response attributes. So here we can see the name, the label. Let me see. Any information here that helps me? Yeah, those are the coordinates. Where are the coordinates? Maybe I'm overlooking something. Do a quick search. Okay, that's just in the JSON body. Where we go? Ah, here. Note that the coordinates elements are longitude, latitude in that order. Okay, so whenever you have an API, you just need to read the documentation. As I could see, I was just looking for a thing here, longitude and latitude. So that means that if I hop back into my workflow, the first one is longitude and latitude. That's correct. So let's run that. There we go. But now we actually want to see this on a map. And this is actually pretty cool in Alteryx. We can now add a third element in here, which is some geospatial tools. So I can hop into the spatial section and bring my create points tool. And my create points tool can turn latitude and longitude into actual spatial objects, which we can then further on use. Now here we have the create points, and as I said, longitude and latitude will be automatically recognized as longitude and latitude. Yeah, and these are floating points, which is fine. If you want to set different projections, you can do that here, but we just have the standard projection, which Tableau also supports, which is WGS 84. And let's have a look at the results. So if I hit run, Alteryx will give you a map output here. And the cool thing is that in the latest version, these maps are pretty neat. There we go. So now here we go. We have our restaurant, the Fish and Chips place, Greenwich High Road. There we go. So now I've done this for one URL, right? For one restaurant. But because I know that this TripAdvisor has structured every website the same for all of those restaurants, what I can do is I can just remove my sample tool on the beginning. I can say right click and say delete and connect around. So it will actually connect again. If I then hit run, it will now download 10 HTML files, parse all 10 of them, send them through the API. After that, it's geocoding it. And now I can go to my browse and I can see all 10 of the restaurants here. Okay, so this is a very typical thing that I do. Whenever I do web scraping or APIs, I cache my records, but I also use 1 or 2 examples and then run it for the whole thing. Now, as you can see, this looks a little bit different than the chart that I showed you, or the map that I showed you in one of the first slides. Because what that one is, if I go to the slides, this one is using, if I go up, this one is using the isochrones. So that basically means how far can we go within a 30-minute journey. That is a different API request you can make. And that is also in the documentation. So if I go into this one, we have like the time map. So if I go to the time map, you can find shapes of zones reachable with corresponding travel time. So that's pretty cool. And you can see how far can I go in 10 minutes by public transport, by cycling, by car, etc. How that looks in a Tableau dashboard is we actually outputted this and we generated this example workbook. And this example workbook, as you can see here, has all of the kind of the locations here of those restaurants. And then also these, what they call isochrones of how far we can go. So we can, for example, filter down to walking. You can see from the Tobacco Docks where, excuse me, where the Inspire conference was hosted. We can see that we could walk this far in 10 minutes. So we could about reach some of these. I think we can get that. No, that's not our fish and chips place, but public transport, you can get a little bit further. And if you do driving, you could go far further. So those are kind of the options that you can have with this API. You can overlay it as well. So that's, I think, pretty neat. So yeah, just to sum up, what we've done is we went from inputting data from a website, just URLs, downloading that in Alteryx by using the download tool, then generating and creating an API endpoint, which has that postcode added to it, sending that request to the API, and we authenticate ourselves by using this application ID and API key. The response is a JSON format, so we can use the JSON parse tool to easily format this, do a little bit of geocoding, and then we're getting all of that data in a nice to look at map. Okay, cool. So let me see. What I also want to mention is that this was not really follow along session. So if you want to, first of all, learn more about Alteryx, but also about Tableau, I would highly recommend going to this meetup page. It's Let's Talk Data. If you're not member yet, I think you're all members because otherwise you wouldn't be on this call. But yeah, you can join all of these sessions if you want to. They're all free. This one is ongoing. That's where you're currently in. But we have, for example, also on November the 6th, we have a webinar about Alteryx efficiency. My colleague Chris Love will run that. So yeah, please sign up for these. We also have more free training. I think we have some stuff about APIs as well in the future, which is like an like a classroom-based training. Cool. Having said that, let me see if I can unmute people. So if there are any questions, we can answer those questions. Let me see if I unmute all. Are we getting lots of noise? Okay, now you have the ability to talk, or you can also ask a question. Yes, someone asked if this is a REST API. Correct. This is the API that we used is a RESTful API. Let me put the link to the API, not that one, in the chat so you can have some. There we go. All panels that like this. There we go. Cool. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer those. Yes. How did I see if it was a dynamically generated website? That's a very good point. So this wasn't a dynamically generated because if I open this and I go to view page source, I can see all the content in here. Now, what you sometimes have with some websites, they're dynamically generated, like Instagram, right? When you scroll down in Instagram or you scroll down into Facebook, whenever you make that action, it will generate content for you. So that means it's actually not making a request to the server. It's just generating that on the fly for you. So that makes it a little bit more difficult to web scrape. But yeah, that is also something to trial and error in Alteryx. But what I often do is I just check the page source, and if the data is in this page source that I'm actually looking for, then you can also get it in in Alteryx, and you can find the page source by right-clicking and say View Page Source. Yeah, I think someone raised their hand. If you have any questions, please speak. Yes, can I go over how I built the formula to get the postcode? Yes, very good. So if I go back into Alteryx, here I have the formula. And what I'm doing is I basically create a string here. So you can see here I have HTTPS. This is the URL, geocoding, search, and query. And this postcode here is dynamically generated depending on which URL I'm looking at. So I'm downloading this actually from the website. So for the next restaurant, this part of the URL is different. But what is static is this whole bit. HTTP, API, travel time, etc. Now, how did I find that? I normally go to the API documentation. So if I go back to the documentation, in here it will tell me if I go to authentication first, it tells me how to get to authentication. But if I go to the geocoding, what it will tell me is that, where do we go? Yeah, here we need to send a query. So you can see the query that we need to send. And queries are normally sent by basically doing a question mark and then query equals, and then you can type in the postcode that you want to do. So and query equals postcode. And then the next one, if you want to add something, you can also do and in this case we have within country equals, and then you can also type in like UK or something. So those are parameters that you add to a URL, but the URL part in this case was static, and I grabbed those from the API documentation. And this is the static part of this. So you can see if I go to the output, you can see here that I have generated this 10 times depending on which URL I'm looking at. Yes. How do you scrape information that are rendered client side? Yeah, you need to write a little bit more. You could do it with like the Python integration in Alteryx. I tend to use JavaScript to do it, but in Alteryx it's a little bit tricky to do it. My colleague Brian, he wrote a good blog post about this. Let me see if I can find it for you. Let me see. I think he had a blog post about this. I can probably paste it in here. Let me see. Web scraping JavaScript content. Yes. So it's this blog post. Let me put that in the chat. There we go. Brilliant, thanks. How about getting the postcode out of the HTML? Yes, so how I did that is I used a regular expression to do that. This is a regular expression. So postal code is it's the part of what's in the HTML, and then here you can see the brackets. Everything that's in the normal brackets is what I'm getting out of this. This is regular expressions. If you want to learn more about regular expressions, then we have another webinar coming up that focuses solely on writing regular expressions and learning about that. And with this API, you created one call per each postcode. Can you create one call for all 10 postcodes to improve the performance? Yeah, that's a good point, because I don't think this API supports bulk querying, but you can, in some APIs, you can actually do some like bulk requests where you can send one request off with lots of information, and then you get that back. That would be a great way to optimize the performance and also the rate limiting, but I don't think this API supports that. So So if you want to attend more of these sessions, let me put in the link here. As you can see, they're all free to attend. We normally do them over lunch, so you can eat and listen. Next question, how does the download tool handle paging through Alteryx? Yeah, I think I know what you mean. So what that means is we have, you can see 10 URLs here. And what the download tool does is for each row, it gets for each URL, it generates a new row. So if you send it 10 rows of data, it also returns you 10 rows of data. Okay. So that's basically in the download tool, it does that automatically for you. So it doesn't aggregate that. Yeah, so that's with the multiple page scraping. Yes, you can also stick all of these behind after each other, so you can have like multiple download tools after each other if you want to. Okay, I think those were all the questions. Thanks a lot for listening. I always enjoy talking about web scraping and APIs. Yeah, please do sign up for any future sessions. And if you want to learn more about Alteryx, then please do. And yeah, so have a nice weekend, and we'll catch you in the next one. Thank you.